California, 1857. The obese lady who collected albino boy slaves and did things so horrible you wouldn't want to know. A receipt for burlap, lye, and a child-sized coat. A house on the hill with windows like vacant eyes. In the snow, I saw a face, pale as bone, white hair, gone in a breath. Then my ledger showed the pattern. Every 2 years, small clothes, food, medicine that made the world slow. Then lie and silence. Then it started again. The circuit judge called her charitable. This is how their secret finally surfaced, scratched into a floorboard and buried in a well. If the law protects the predator, who protects the child? Before we dive in, hit subscribe to honor the voices history tried to bury. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. I love seeing how far truth can travel. A town's history is not always in its charter. Sometimes it's in the receipts. Page 47 of the Solitude Creek Mercantile Ledger, dated October 1857. 3 yards of burlap, a gallon of lye, and a child-sized wool coat. The customer, Mrs. Elspeth Crow. It was the third such order that year. It would not be the last. Elias Vance stood behind his counter that morning, the way he had stood behind 1,000 counters before. Light from a dusty window illuminated his face, catching the fine lines around his eyes, the gray at his temples. He was a man in his 50s, a veteran of the Mexican War, a man who had learned long ago that chaos comes not from noise, but from the absence of order. He kept his store the way he had kept his supply wagons, every nail counted, every transaction recorded in clear, steady script. He planned a stray wood shaving from the counter, his movements precise and unhurried. He observed everything. The bell above the door rang just past noon. Tommy, the delivery boy, stumbled in with the empty cart, his face pale despite the autumn chill. He was 15, strong-backed, usually quick with a smile. Not today. He left the goods on the porch, he told Elias. As instructed. He didn't knock. Mrs. Crow never wanted anyone to knock. He set the parcel down and turned to go. But then he heard something from an upper window. A sound like a bird trapped in a box. A soft, high sound that stopped as suddenly as it started. Then silence. Tommy looked up at Elias, his hands shaking slightly as he unhitched the cart. He said he didn't like going up there. He said the house felt wrong. Elias paid him, watched him leave, then turned his gaze to the hill. The Crow mansion sat above the town like a judge on a bench, its dark wood siding and shuttered windows giving it the air of something sealed. Its windows were like vacant eyes. Elias had seen Mrs. Crow only a handful of times in the 2 years since she'd arrived from back east. She was an immense woman, so heavy she moved with difficulty, her breathing audible from across a room. She sent her orders by post and paid promptly. She never came to town. The town, Turn, mostly forgot she was there. But Elias did not forget. His ledger would not let him. Days passed. The first light snow came early that year, dusting the rooftops and the bare trees. Elias was closing up for the evening when he looked up at the Crow house one more time. The sun was setting, the sky a bruised purple, and in that brief cold light he saw it, a flash of white against a darkened windowpane, a small, pale face, a child with hair as white as the falling snow. The face was there for only a moment, pressed close to the glass, and then it was gone. Elias stood very still. He had seen children in this town all his life. He knew their faces. That was not one of them. He went back inside and pulled his ledger from the shelf. He turned the pages slowly, running his finger down the columns. Mrs. Crow's orders were regular, predictable, and expensive. There were the household staples, of course. Oats, milk, root vegetables, candles, soap. But there were other things too. Small boys' clothing, always the same size, always plain and durable. And every month, without fail, a crate shipped in from Philadelphia. The label read, "Soothing tonic for delicate nerves." The cost was considerable. Elias had written it down a dozen times, never questioning it. After all, what business was it of his? What a wealthy woman ordered for her home. But now he questioned it. He turned back further. 1855, the first order for a small boy's coat. Then months of steady purchases. Then, in the spring of 1857, a sudden order for a large quantity of lye. Several burlap sacks. Then, for a few weeks, nothing. Then the cycle began again. Another coat, another round of provisions, and always, always the tonic. Elias closed the ledger and placed it carefully back on the shelf. The fire crackled in the stove. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. He looked from his book to the house on the hill, its dark silhouette barely visible against the night sky. He realized, with a cold certainty that settled in his chest like stone, that the receipts he had been writing were not for a household. They were for a prison, and he was the only one keeping a record. A record of what? He did not yet know, but the question hung in the cold air, unanswered and terrible. What was happening in that house, and how long had it been happening before he ever put pen to paper? Elias began his audit the next morning, though he told no one what he was doing. He did not seek gossip. He did not ask questions in the street. He sought facts, and facts lived in his ledgers. He pulled the heavy books from 1855, 56, and 57, and laid them open on the counter under the lamplight. The pages smelled of dust and ink, and the faint scent of tobacco from his pipe. He ran his finger down each column, his eyes narrowing as the pattern emerged. It was chillingly clear once you knew to look for it. Mrs. Elspeth Crow's purchases told a story, and it was not the story of a charitable woman caring for sickly orphans. It was something else entirely. The first phase always began the same way. An order for a small boy's set of clothes. Identical items, durable cotton shirt, wool trousers, a simple coat, plain, unremarkable. This was followed by months of steady purchases, oats, milk, root vegetables, the food of someone feeding a child. And always, every single month, the soothing tonic for delicate nerves. 2 bottles at first, then 3, then 4. The second phase came after about 2 years. The food orders became simpler. Less milk, more oats and water. The tonic orders doubled, then tripled. Elias could see it in the numbers. Whatever was happening in that house, it was intensifying. The child was being subdued, kept quiet, kept compliant. Then came the third phase, and this was where Elias felt the cold creep up his spine. A sudden, final order. A large quantity of lye, several burlap sacks, heavy rope. Then, for a few weeks, silence. No orders at all. The ledger sat empty, as if the house on the hill had simply stopped existing. And then, the fourth phase. The cycle restarted. A new order for a small boy's set of clothes. The same sizes, the same plain, durable fabric. And the purchases resumed, steady as clockwork. Elias lined up the dates. 1855, 1857. The cycle was precise, mechanical, inevitable. He realized he was not tracking one boy. He was tracking a position that was filled, emptied, and filled again. The mercantile ledger, a simple record of commerce, had become a timeline of disappearance. Each entry was a life reduced to a line of ink. Each gap was a grave he could not see. He needed to know more. He needed confirmation that what he suspected was not the product of a disturbed mind, but the truth. So he went to see Cobb, the town's freight driver, a grizzled man in his 60s who had hauled goods from Sacramento to Solitude Creek for 20 years. Cobb lived in a small shack near the livery, and when Elias found him, he was mending harness leather by the light of a single candle. Elias asked him about the crates, the ones for Mrs. Crow, the ones shipped in from the city. Cobb looked up, his scarred hands pausing in their work. He nodded slowly. He said he remembered. Once, maybe twice a year, there'd be a crate that was different from the rest, smaller, lighter than it should be for its size. And it had air holes drilled into the sides. He'd asked about it once, and the shipping agent in Sacramento told him it was for rare porcelain dolls. Fragile things that needed ventilation to keep the backing straw from molding. Cobb said he thought it strange at the time, but he didn't ask questions. It wasn't his place. But then he leaned forward, his voice dropping. He said he remembered one trip in particular, in the winter of 1856. He'd hauled that crate up the hill himself, and as he set it down on the porch, he heard a sound from inside. Not the sound of porcelain shifting, a soft, high sound, like a bird trapped in a box. He'd looked at the crate, looked at the air holes, and then Mrs. Crow's voice came from inside the house, sharp and impatient, telling him to leave it and go. So he did. He never thought twice about it. Until now. Elias thanked him and walked back to the mercantile in the fading light. The pieces were falling into place, each one more damning than the last. The clothes, the food, the tonic that kept them docile, the lie that erased them, and the crates that brought them in the first place. He sat at his counter that night, the ledger open before him, and he understood the full scope of what he was looking at. This was not a single crime. It was a system, a quiet, efficient system that had been running for years, hidden behind the respectability of wealth and the indifference of a small town that did not ask questions. He closed the ledger and looked out at a dark hill. Somewhere in that house, a child was living in that system right now. And Elias Vance, a man who had spent his life counting deals and recording sales, was the only person in the world who knew. The boy's name was Silas, though no one in Solitude Creek knew that. No one knew he existed at all. His world was the upper floor of the Crow Mansion, 3 rooms connected by a narrow hallway that creaked with every step. Perpetual dim light filtered through heavy curtains, thick fabric that turned the California sun into a sickly gray glow. The air was oppressive, thick with the smell of dust and lavender water, and something medicinal and bitter that clung to everything. He could hear the floorboards groaning under Mrs. Crow's immense weight as she moved through the house below, her wheezing breath a constant presence that told him where she was at all times. He had been there for a year and a half, though time had lost its shape. There was only the routine, the waking, the washing with cold water from a basin, the silent dressing in the same plain clothes. And then the wait, always the wait, for her footsteps on the stairs, for the door to open, for the daily ritual that made the world slow and soft. The tonic came every morning. Mrs. Crow brought it herself, breathing hard from the climb, her massive frame filling the doorway. She never spoke his name. She called him her porcelain figure, a delicate one. She poured the dark syrupy liquid into a spoon and held it to his lips, and he swallowed because there was no choice. It tasted like burnt sugar and something metallic underneath, something that made his tongue go numb. Within minutes, the world became distant. His thoughts moved like molasses. His limbs felt heavy. The fear which lived in his chest like a trapped animal went quiet. The rule of silence was absolute. The boys, and there had been others before Silas, though he only understood this in fragments, were not to speak unless spoken to. They were to sit when told to sit, to stand when told to stand, to keep their hands folded, to keep their eyes down. Mrs. Crow prized their pale skin and white hair. She called them her collection. She would sit in her chair, the wood groaning under her weight, and simply look at them for hours. Sometimes she would reach out and touch their hair, running her thick fingers through it, murmuring words Silas could not understand. Freckles or sun exposure were punished. Once, Silas had stood too close to the window, and a shaft of sunlight had touched his arm. She had locked him in the closet for 2 days, with no food, only water, and when she let him out, she told him his skin must remain pure, pure and white and untouched. There were 2 other boys when Silas first arrived. He never learned their names. One was older, maybe 12 or 13, his eyes distant and glassy from the tonic. The other was younger, small and thin, his hair so white it seemed to glow in the dim light. They did not speak to each other. They had learned, long before Silas came, that speaking brought punishment. But they communicated in glances, in the slight movements of hands, in the way they stood close when Mrs. Crow was not watching. It was the only comfort they had. Then one day, the older boy grew sick. He coughed through the night, a wet, rattling sound. Mrs. Crow increased his tonic, but the coughing continued. And then, one morning, he was gone. Mrs. Crow told them he had been taken to the quiet room to rest. The quiet room was at the far end of the upstairs hall, behind a door that was always locked. Silas had heard sounds from that room sometimes, late at night. The scrape of something heavy being moved, the sound of water being poured. Then silence. The older boy never came back. No one ever came back from the quiet room. A few months later, the younger boy began to change. He was growing. His voice, when he accidentally cried out in his sleep, was deeper. Mrs. Crow noticed. She looked at him with a cold, calculating gaze, and the next day she doubled his tonic. He slept most of the time after that, barely able to stand. And then, one morning, he was gone too, taken to the quiet room. Silas was alone. He understood in the part of his mind that the tonic could not quite reach, that he was not a person to Mrs. Crow. He was a thing, a delicate, breakable thing that served a purpose he did not understand. And when that purpose was done, when he grew too old or too sick or too aware, he would be taken to the quiet room like the others. The dread lived in his bones now, deeper than the tonic could touch. It was in the knowing, in the certainty that the door at the end of the hall was waiting for him, and that no one in the world outside even knew he was there. At night, when the house was silent and Mrs. Crow's wheezing breath came from her room below, Silas would lie awake and try to remember who he had been before. But the tonic had taken that too. He remembered only fragments. Woman's voice singing, the smell of bread baking, a hand holding his, and then the grate, the darkness, the air holes that let in slivers of light, the journey that ended here, in this dim prison, where he was not a boy, but a porcelain figure in a collection that no one would ever see. Elias Vance made his decision on a cold morning in November of 1857. He could not live with the knowledge and do nothing. He gathered his ledgers, the pages marked with slips of paper at every damning entry, and he walked to the town's only hotel where the circuit judge was staying. Judge Harlan Whitmore was a man in his 60s, heavy-set and irritable, annoyed to be in such a backwater on his rounds. He was scheduled to leave the next day, and Elias knew this was his only chance. The judge received him in the hotel's small parlor, a fire crackling in the grate. He did not offer Elias a seat. He stood with his hands behind his back, his expression one of barely concealed impatience, and asked what matter could possibly require his attention in a town like Solitude Creek. Elias laid the ledgers on the table. He opened them to the marked pages. He explained the pattern, his voice steady and measured, the way he had once given reports to his commanding officers. The clothes, the food, the tonic, the lie, the cycle that repeated every 2 years, the freight driver's testimony about the crates with air holes, the pale face he had seen in the window. Judge Whitmore listened, his eyes moving over the columns of figures. When Elias finished, the judge closed the ledger with a soft thud. He looked at Elias the way one might look at a child who has misunderstood a simple lesson. He said, "This is a book of sales, Mr. Vance, not a book of crimes. Mrs. Crow is a woman of means and charity. These boys, if they exist, are sickly orphans from the city. It is a tragedy of their condition, not a fault of her care." He tapped the ledger with one thick finger. "Lie," he said, "is used for cleaning. Burlap is used for storage. A woman of her station orders many things. It does not make her a criminal." Elias tried to press further. He spoke of the timing, the precision of the cycle, the disappearance of the boys. But Judge Whitmore raised his hand, cutting him off. He said that he would not entertain baseless accusations against a respectable woman based on the paranoid interpretations of a shopkeeper. He warned Elias, his voice taking on a sharp edge, against spreading malicious rumors. He said that if Elias continued to slander Mrs. Crow, he would find himself facing charges of defamation. The law, he said, protects the innocent from the hysterical, and with that, he dismissed Elias from the room. But the judge, perhaps feeling some small obligation, agreed to make a formal visit to the Crow mansion the following morning. Elias watched from the street as the judge's carriage made its way up the hill. He waited, his heart pounding, hoping that the judge would see what he had seen, that the truth would be undeniable once someone with authority looked closely. The judge was inside for over an hour. When he emerged, he was smiling. He climbed into his carriage and returned to the hotel. And that afternoon, he summoned Elias once more. The judge's tone was one of satisfaction, even triumph. He told Elias that he had toured the home, spoken with Mrs. Crow at length, and seen the quarters where the boys, 3 of them currently, were housed. They were clean, well-fed, and properly cared for. Mrs. Crow had explained that they were orphans with a rare condition that made them sensitive to sunlight, which was why they remained indoors. She provided them with medicine to ease their discomfort. She was, in the judge's words, a woman of extraordinary generosity, giving these unfortunate souls a home when no one else would. He told Elias that he should be ashamed of himself for attempting to tarnish such a woman's reputation. And then he left Solitude Creek, his duty fulfilled, his conscience clear. Elias stood in the street as the judge's carriage disappeared down the road. Authority had failed. The door was shut. The system, the one he had believed in, the one he had served in war, had looked at the evidence and chosen not to see. He returned to his store and sat at his counter, the ledgers still open before him. The truth was there, written in his own hand, but it might as well have been invisible. A heavy snow came that night, blanketing Solitude Creek and cutting it off from the outside world. The roads became impassable. The Crow House was a dark monolith on the hill, unreachable, its windows like vacant eyes staring down at the town. Elias sat by his stove, the fire burning low, and he stared at the ledger. The numbers stared back. 3 yards of burlap, a gallon of lye, a child-sized coat. He thought of the pale face in the window. He thought of Silas, a name he did not know, a boy who was at that very moment living in that house, drinking the tonic that made the world slow, waiting for the day he would be taken to the quiet room. Elias was alone with the knowledge. The snow, the law, and the town's indifference threatened to bury it forever. He had no authority. He had no allies. He had only the ledger and the certainty that evil was happening, systematic and patient, just beyond his reach. The moral test was laid before him, and he did not know if he had passed or failed. He had spoken the truth, and the truth had been dismissed. So he did the only thing he could. He kept the ledger. He recorded every order. And he waited, hoping that someday someone would see what he saw, that someday the record he kept would matter. 15 years passed. The year was 1872. Elias Vance was an old man now, his hair white, his hands gnarled with age, but his mind remained sharp and his ledgers remained pristine. The town of Solitude Creek had grown. New families had arrived. The railway had come within 10 miles, bringing commerce and noise, and a future that felt nothing like the quiet, isolated place it had been. Elspeth Crow had died years ago, in 1868, alone in her mansion. A great weight had finally rendered her bedridden, and when the doctor was called, too late, he found her in her chair. Her breath stopped, her eyes open and staring at nothing. She was buried in the town cemetery with a grand tombstone that bore her name and the word benefactor carved beneath it. The house stood empty after that. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live where she had lived. It decayed slowly, the wood graying, the shutters hanging loose, the windows cracking in the winter cold. The town left it alone, a monument to something no one wanted to remember. But now, in 1872, a group of investors from Sacramento had purchased the land. They planned to tear the house down and build something new, something modern. The demolition crew arrived in the spring, and Elias, hearing the news, walked up the hill one last time. He stood in the entryway, the air thick with dust and the smell of rot. The grand staircase was still intact, though the banister was loose. He climbed slowly, his knees aching, and made his way to the upper floor. He found the rooms where the boys had been kept. They were small, bare, the wallpaper peeling away in long strips. There was no furniture left, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. But Elias knew. He had kept the record. He knew exactly how many boys had passed through these rooms. He knew their sizes by the clothes he had sold. He knew their presence by the oats and milk and the tonic that never stopped coming until it did. He walked through the rooms slowly, his footsteps echoing on the bare boards. And then, in the corner of the smallest room, he saw it. A floorboard that sat slightly higher than the others, its nails loose. He knelt, his joints protesting, and pried it up with his fingers. Beneath it, in the dark space between the joists, was not a journal or a letter. It was a series of desperate etchings scratched into the underside of the board with a nail. The wood was soft with age, and the marks were crude but unmistakable. There was a large, round shape, a woman. Her body filled the space, her arms outstretched. Around her were small stick figures, white lines scratched deep into the green. Boys with no faces, and beside them, a bottle, the tonic. And then, at the edge of the board, a crude map, a square that might have been the house, a line that might have been a path, and an X drawn over and over until the wood was gouged, marking a spot in the backyard. The old stone-capped well. Elias took the board and carried it down the stairs, out into the daylight. He went directly to the new town marshal. a young man named Garrett, who had only been in the position for 2 years. Garrett listened, his face growing pale, as Elias explained what he had found, what he had known for 15 years. They returned to the property together, and they walked to the backyard where the well stood, its heavy stone lid covered in moss and weeds. It had not been opened in years, perhaps decades. They brought a crowbar. It took both of them to heave the stone lid off, the ancient iron hinges screaming in protest. The smell that rose from the depths was immediate and overpowering, rot and earth and lime. Garrett covered his mouth and nose with his sleeve. Elias stood firm, though his eyes watered. They lowered a lantern on a rope, and in the flickering light they saw them. Burlap sacks, weighed down with stones, stacked at the bottom of the well. Some had rotted through, and the small, brittle bones inside were visible, pale against the dark earth. Garrett staggered back, his face grey. Elias stood at the edge of the well, looking down, and he felt a grief so profound it threatened to break him. These were the boys he had recorded, the ones whose clothes he had sold, whose food he had provided, whose existence he had documented, while the world looked away. They had names once, they had voices, and now they were only bones in burlap, hidden in the dark, their deaths as systematic and efficient as the orders that had preceded them. The law could not prosecute a dead woman. There would be no trial, no sentence, no public accounting of Elspeth Crow's crimes. But memory could pass a sentence. The story of what was found in the well swept through Solitude Creek and the surrounding county like wildfire. Newspapers in Sacramento picked it up. The name Elspeth Crow, once spoken with a careful neutrality, became a curse. A grand tombstone was pushed over by persons unknown and left to be swallowed by grass and weeds. No one righted it. No one ever would. The town council met and voted to remove her name from the founding plaque in the town square. The land where her house had stood was salted, an old ritual, and left fallow. No one would ever build there again. The bones were buried in the town cemetery, in a plot far from Elspeth Crow's desecrated grave. A simple stone was placed there, with no names, only the words, "The Lost Boys of Solitude Creek." The town archives, a single dusty room in the new courthouse, now held one artifact from that time. Elias Vance's mercantile ledger, open to page 47, the page that started it all. His careful, steady script was the only monument the victims would ever have. It was their voice. It was the proof. The house was torn down. The land went to seed. Elspeth Crow's name was forgotten by all but those who kept the records. But the ledger remained, a simple accounting of goods that became a record of evil. It tells us that even when the law is silent, the facts speak. And the land always remembers.